Many years ago, I saw a stunning photograph in a news magazine, taken in the aftermath of a hurricane that struck a Caribbean island. Torrential downpours suddenly turned gentle streams into raging rivers. A father and his small children became stranded on a tiny island in the middle of one such river and were in danger of being swept away when some passers-by on the bank spotted them. The men realized, apparently, they couldn't wait for professional help, and so attempted a rescue effort of their own. A photographer was in the area, and that's exactly the moment when he came upon the scene, saw what the men were doing, and recorded their courageous actions. A line was strung across the angry water, and one of the men, holding onto the line for dear life, managed to make it across to the family. He took the youngest child in his arms and began to make his way back through the water to the opposite bank. The little girl held on to the man as tight as she could. But when they were midway across, she began to lose her grip apparently, as the pounding water was tearing her away from her rescue. That's the moment the photographer got the stunning photo. The photograph showed the rescuer grasping the safety line with one hand and with the other holding the little girl tight to him. She was able to hold on no longer, but he would not and did not let her go. He held her tight in the midst of that fierce river until at last, somehow, he managed to bring her to safety. And if you want to understand what Paul meant by the peace of God which passes all understanding, then think of that photograph. And if you want to understand how Paul could say, rejoice in the Lord always, then picture that scene. And if you want to understand how Paul could say, don't worry about anything, or as another translation has it, have no anxiety about anything, then imagine that child and her rescuer. Because that's what Paul meant by the peace of God, by joy, and why he could say, no longer be anxious. It means to be held fast by God, and to believe that God will not let us go, that nothing can tear us away from God. And how we do need to picture that, believe that, because in today's world we sure know a lot about worry, anxiety, all the rest. If you still happen to work, you know a lot about worry. The coronavirus changing everything. So much up in the air, unclear, uncertain, making it hard not to worry. Not worry about cutbacks, losing your job, losing everything. And kids, if you have kids, grandkids, then you know all about worry and anxiety. Kids come home from school with stories of sex, drugs, and guns, and they're still in elementary school. Kitty and I told our girls to tell us everything. We want to know everything. They did. And we became so upset and scared and blurted out so often, now listen, don't you dare do anything like that, that the girls said they're going to stop telling us everything. And that was nearly 40 years ago and more. It's 10 times worse now. Just the other evening, Kitty and I happened to tune in a program on PBS, and in the upper left-hand corner of the screen was the rating. The program was rated 7+, which meant a child 6 years old or under really should not watch it, but those who were 7 and older, that was fine. The reason given for the rating was simply this: drug use, sexuality, and violence. Trust me, it wasn't long ago when such content rated a PG-13 rating, maybe an R rating. Not today. Apparently, being 7 years old just ain't what it used to be. It's a very different world today. For kids, grandkids, and all that. A much more frightening world. And then there's health. We worry about our health. Normal health problems that come with age are worry enough, but now we've got the virus on top of everything else. And money, having enough, making it stretch farther, hoping it'll last through retirement. We are well acquainted with worry and anxiety. Someone has suggested that anxiety is both something of a disease and an addiction. It's something of a disease because in one sense, we can't help but be anxious. We feel an unusual pain before we can stop ourselves. We're convinced it's cancer. A child is late coming home, and before we can catch ourselves, we picture the child kidnapped or in a car accident. We read of layoffs, the stock market wavering, and before we know it, we see ourselves out on the street. But anxiety is also something of an addiction because in another sense, we choose anxiety. Sometimes we think that if we imagine the worst that can possibly happen, then by some strange magic, we can prevent it from happening. Or by worrying enough, we think that maybe somehow we can avoid what we worry about. Or we figure that if we don't allow ourselves to feel too good, too happy, then maybe bad things won't happen. Let's face it, some of us, I won't name who I'm including in this, even worry about not worrying enough. As if to worry is to care and to show God how much we care. Look at how worried I am. And who can blame us? Because sometimes the worst does happen. Test results do come back positive. Children do get hurt. Death and disease, they do strike unexpectedly. Sometimes it does all happen. So we seem to have every good reason to worry and be anxious. But it's not just worry or anxiety that keeps us from peace and joy that Paul speaks of. It can be anger as well. And Lord knows there is so much anger within us these days. And maybe one main source of our anger today is so much is beyond our control. Regardless of the job we've done, some strangers in a boardroom can tell us we're really not of any value or needed anymore. Or maybe no matter how hard we try to raise children, be there for grandchildren, help them, prepare them right, protect them, they can be swept away by their own foolishness or disease or accident. And no matter how much we carefully live, illness can still strike. No matter how thoroughly we plan, still not be enough. And of course the anger of others. Anger because others seem to control us by demands and expectations and fear. And then there's politics. Don't get me started on that. You know, often we do have every right to be angry, though. Should be angry. But like anxiety, anger can become something both of a disease and an addiction. We find ourselves getting angry at everything. Everyone. We just can't help it. But we also choose to remain angry. It's a way of saying, hey, I'm of value. I'm of worth. You can't do that. But as with anxiety, so too with anger. Like any disease or addiction, it can cripple us, keep us far from peace and joy. So, how we need to hear Paul's words today. But if you're anything like me, when you hear Paul's words about rejoice in everything, have no anxiety, you don't know whether to laugh or cry. Yet, before we do, we need to understand that Paul himself knew that the worst can happen. As I said in the introductions, he wrote these words while languishing in prison, facing possible execution. He knew all about how your life can be controlled by others. And he was well acquainted with illness and violence and not having enough. He'd been robbed, beaten, shipwrecked, gone hungry, and suffered most every day from some unnamed mysterious illness. And he sure knew what it was like to fail, to be fired, to be ridiculed, and treated of little worth. And yet he says what he says. Speaks of peace, joy. Says not to be anxious. And the question is, how can he say it and keep a straight face? Because he believes that the Lord is near. That's Paul's source of joy, the only source, God's presence in Christ. And perhaps one reason we can be so far from peace and joy is that we always look for it in the wrong places. We look for it or expect to find it in others or within ourselves. But the hard truth is we won't. If you work now or have worked or retired, you remember what it was like. You didn't find much peace at the shop or the office, that's for sure. Because there were far too many problems, far too many demands, far too many people who just didn't agree with you or didn't like you or had these little nice knives that would stab you in the back. That is not peace. And if you expect family or relationships to give you enduring joy and peace, well, think again. Far too many conflicting wants and desires and expectations, and others just are always going to disappoint when it comes to giving us peace and joy. And we don't find it within ourselves either. Too many conflicting thoughts and wants. It's only the presence of God, the nearness of Christ, that can give us that peace and joy. Knowing that God guards our hearts and minds. The peace of knowing that God holds us fast through all things. That nothing can separate us from God's love. And Paul knew that better than anyone. And he knew that no matter what he went through, God was near. And when Paul could no longer hold on, God held on to him and rescued him, brought him through, would not let him be swept away. What Paul knew, what I mentioned earlier, is simply peace is not the absence of conflict or trouble. He had plenty of that. But the presence, the assurance of a presence of God. And yes, he also meant that the Lord is near in another sense, that Christ's return is near. And maybe we're not quite sure what to make of that notion, given all the gaudy talk and lurid descriptions we hear about the end of all things. But at the very least, what Paul meant was that he believed that the future was held securely in God's hands. That things weren't out of control, that the future was not up for grabs, that the hope for a return to holiness was real. That God had the power to bring about new life and new possibility. And one thing more. In that parable I mentioned, where Jesus speaks of many being invited, but that few are chosen, that there are those who are invited but show up because they refuse to prepare the proper attire, or show them the door. Well, what he speaks is a hard truth. We are invited to God's peace and joy, but we have to choose it. Choose to trust enough, have faith enough, to let go of our anxieties and worries and angers. Another Christian also found himself jailed because of his beliefs, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And he wrote this while he was in prison. It has been borne upon me in here with peculiar force that a concrete situation can always be mastered, and that only fear and anxiety magnify them to an unmeasurable degree beforehand. From the moment we wake up until we fall asleep, we must commend our loved ones wholly and unrestrictedly to God and leave them in His care, transforming our anxiety into prayers on their behalf. And I would add that we must also commend ourselves to God throughout the day. What we must choose to do is keep transforming our worry and anxiety into prayer. Transform it into faith. Transform our anger into trust. And to choose that is to be transformed. Transformed by God's own peace and joy. But it's not easy. Not easy at all. So much does it seem that there are days when we need those worries and angers. So maybe we ought to end today where we begin, with a photo of the child held tight in a raging current. And if anxiety or worry or anger overwhelms you and you feel like it's threatening to sweep you away, begin with imagining yourself held by God. Imagining yourself to be that child in the arms of her rescuer. And trust it until at last the peace and joy you can only imagine begins to enfold you and guard you like nothing you've ever known before. Amen.